My name is Mike Ricardo, and I would like to thank you for joining our webinar today. This is the first in the series, Life Science Webinar Series, and today's topic is how to prepare for your company's eventual M&A transaction. During the presentation, your individual audio will be muted until the question and answer session in order to minimize background noise. There will be a question and answer session after the presentation, and you'll be able to submit questions via the question box located in your control panel. You will also be able to ask questions via telephone by clicking on the yellow hand to the left of your control panel. After the webinar, we would appreciate if you could respond to a follow-up survey that will be sent to you. Now with that, let's get started. I would like to introduce Mike Bates, who will begin the presentation. Mike?
Hi, thanks a lot, Mike, and welcome to today's presentation. I'd like to tell you a little bit about my story and my experience in the M&A world. I'm the former CFO of 4 life science companies over a 12-year period, all of which were sold. The first of them was Peniderm, which was a public company we sold to Mylan in 1998 for $205 million. And the others you can see on the slide here, Collagen, Silicon Genetics, and St. Francis Medical. And when I look back on this, there's some interesting observations. A few of these companies were public, a couple were private, a couple were done for equity, and a couple were done for cash. And I'd like to talk a little bit about each one because I think they're kind of teach us a little bit about how these transactions come about. So let's start with Peniderm. We sold Peniderm to Mylan, who was a distributor for the company's products. So we really didn't run a formal auction process for that company. So it was a partner to the company where their management knew our management quite well. And they knew us over a period of a year and got comfortable with what we were doing and excited about owning our business, and were willing to do kind of a preemptive deal and offer a premium for the company. So that was kind of my first experience. Then moving on to Collagen. Collagen was a situation where another company essentially tried to do a bear hug strategy on Collagen, which is they came up and met with us privately, offered to buy our company at a value that we thought was insufficient, and when we declined their offer, they put out a press release offering to buy the company at that price as a way of putting pressure on management to kind of succumb to their interest. And as it turned out, our board decided to go ahead and run a formal auction process for the company, so we engaged bankers and took 6 potential acquirers through diligence, and Inamed was the only company to submit a final bid for $16.25 a share in cash. So that was kind of my first experience doing a formal auction process. Silicon Genetics was a much smaller company. We also ran an auction process there. We kind of felt we maximized the value of the company. Our founder wanted to look for a liquidity event, so we hired bankers and ran a process, and Agilent ended up winning that process, and we took their shares. And interestingly, we took those Agilent shares at a time when their stock price was fairly low, and we were able to essentially double the value of our sale price by holding those Agilent shares for a period of time. And then my final transaction, St. Francis Medical, it was also interesting in that it was a dual opportunity to run a dual track, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a few minutes. But a dual track is where you file for an IPO knowing that you're probably going to flush out M&A interest in the company. So we were solidly on an IPO track. We'd filed our registration statement. We were just short of going on the road when we decided to engage one of the bankers in our syndicate to help us auction the company, and in that situation, we had 3 companies interested, and ultimately Kaifon bought the company for $725 million cash. So I think that's an interesting mix of transactions, and they can kind of tell us that these M&A transactions can arise almost at any time and come from a variety of different directions at you. So let's talk for a few minutes about due diligence preparation and what you can be thinking of as a finance officer at your company to get ready for this type of thing that might just land in your lap one day. So I try to start to prepare for due diligence the very first day I join a company, and I do this by using a common sense approach, which is to put myself in the buyer's shoes and say, if I were to come in and look at this company, what would I be interested in seeing? So, another thing that I commonly do is get a due diligence checklist that everybody seems to have, and just start going down that list and accumulating documents and building a data room. And I just try to get things in digital form and organized in folders on a server so that if the time comes, I could put up a data room over a weekend. And these have become larger and larger as I've moved through time. I think the St. Francis data room was 14,000 pages of details. So we actually were able to put up about half of that data room over a weekend because we had done adequate preparation. And this involves sometimes working with other departments in the company. And in particular, if you're in the life sciences industry, regulatory is an area where most acquirers want to see all of the detail behind how your products were approved in your various interactions with the regulatory agency. So in the old days, back maybe in my college days, those records were so voluminous, we actually would have buyers come in on the weekend. We didn't want them to come in during the week to disturb any of our employees, but we would invite them in over a weekend to do their diligence in the regulatory files. But in today's environment, we can digitize most of those documents and make them available in the virtual data room. So I'd like to say a few words about investment banker selection, because I think this is probably one of the first things you run into as you enter a process like this. All four of my transactions were involved investment bankers. And I hear occasional stories about a company that sells itself without investment bankers, and I just think they bring a lot of value to the process. So I've learned a few things about picking a good banker, and that is, I think first of all you should pick the banker first and the firm second. So really it's about a banker that has the correct expertise in your industry and has done similar transactions. And if that person changes firms, you would likely follow them to wherever they go, because I think a lot like a good lawyer, it's more about the particular individual than it is about the firm that you're employing. You want to look for compatibility of what they've done with your deal size. So I did make a mistake along the way with Silicon Genetics. It was a very small company, and at Silicon Genetics we hired a very large investment bank, and what happened was you get assigned to the junior bankers, and you're not getting the VP that attracted you and kind of signed you up. So by picking a firm that's appropriate for your size company, you'll find that you're an important deal to them as a bank, and you'll get the kind of service that you expect. And actually in the Silicon Genetics case, we waited out the tail on this particular banker and engaged a smaller boutique firm that had former bankers from that had large firm experience, and in their new role as boutique bankers, they were much more interested in doing transactions of the size of Silicon Genetics. As a finance person, I think the two things most of interest in your relationship with investment bankers is how to structure the fee, and then the two issues of how long a tail should we have in place on the relationship, and how much of their expenses should we reimburse. So here commonly, people use either a flat rate kind of percentage of the total deal compensation as a way of compensating the banker, or you can move to a tiered fee structure, which I actually prefer because it's kind of more oriented toward pay based on performance. So in a tiered fee structure, you might start out with a lower percentage for a certain amount of value, and then have it have higher percentages as the levels of value increase in total compensation, so that the bankers got an incentive to drive to a higher sale price, essentially. On the tail, many of the bankers will start out asking for a 2-year or 18-month tail on the relationship, and here I think it's important to try to keep that as short as possible, only for the eventuality that no buyer comes forward. You don't want to be committed to that particular banker in perpetuity, so you'd like to keep that tail relatively short. And I suggest capping their expenses, even though typically you're not doing a lot of travel, they're not doing a lot of travel, and if they do, you should be willing to pay for some of that, but maybe not too great an amount. So that's investment banker selection. Let me say a few words about management presentations, because I think this is an important step in the process. You want to get your management team ready to do these, and it's something we don't do every day. So it's often worth the time to have them put a couple slides together in each of their departments, and you can actually do a dry run to where you practice everyone making a short presentation. In my last transactions, St. Francis, we were, as I said, part of the IPO process was doing an org meeting. So as part of that organization meeting, it's natural for each functional leader to say a few words about their department and what they've accomplished, their future goals, and hitting things that how they make a contribution to the overall company value. And then, of course, that would morph slightly if you're in a selling situation to try to tailor it to make sure you hit selling points that are going to drive value. And then, of course, as the finance person or CFO, you pretty much do the long-term strategic model. And I think it's useful to think about synergies and offer up to the buyer population those cost savings you think they can incur that help them justify a higher sale price. So these management presentations typically take about a half a day. You want to keep them off-site. I've done them. We do them mostly in law firms, so your law firms can provide conference rooms of the appropriate size. And even at St. Francis, we also went off-site and used some hotels and took all the buyers one at a time through management presentations off-site. So let's talk a little bit about the dual track. This was quite exciting for me at St. Francis, going through an IPO process. I'll say that this is kind of the dream scenario. I think it's exhausting when you're doing all this work, because you're not only working on all this effort to go public, but you're also preparing to run an M&A process and put up a data room and take people through a very detailed evaluation of your company. So the basic premise for this is that when you file for a public offering, at least back in the 2006-2007 period, company valuations were quite high in the public markets. So buyers actually felt that once a company got public, its value would trade to a point where it became too expensive to acquire. So they would like to try to nab these companies before they got out and realized public company valuations. Of course, times have changed, and so the current environment is that many companies think their IPO valuation is inadequate, and so may file only as a way of getting information out there. And I think having that registration statement on file is probably the best disclosure document that you could write. And one of the things about just running an auction process without filing to go public is that you do have to get some type of information out there about the company, and nobody really wants to spend the effort to write a detailed disclosure document like a registration statement. So anyway, that's a little bit on the dual track. It's probably pretty rare. Maybe we'll see more of this if we get into a better environment here over the next couple of years. Next couple slides, I'll talk about a little bit of a process overview for those of you who have never been through an M&A process. But typically, you engage these bankers. They come in. They want to draft a memorandum of some sort. It could be relatively short. In the case of Collagen, we were a public company. They basically put together a couple-inch volume that was a compilation of all the publicly available information and some sales brochures and what have you to help describe the company's product lines. And they use that to go out and circulate amongst people we felt would be interested buyers. And then you begin to engage with the buyers, and that typically starts off with an NDA, and then at some point they're given access to kind of publicly available information, and they have to kind of express a level of interest that justifies them actually entering into a due diligence process. So this is a bit of a ruse, because I think the bankers typically will let anybody who's interested in to have more diligence. And I would say this about having 3 or more in the process, that I think as you go through this process, it's a difficult thing, but you want to always have the illusion that there's competition for the company. And if you start with 3 buyers, if you have at least 3 buyers that are interested, and one drops out, you still have a horse race. And so you're not just merely bluffing your way to the finish line. But like I said, at Collagen, we had 6 interested companies. Ultimately, 5 of them dropped out as they were doing diligence, and one, Inamed, won the deal. And the first thing they asked when we signed the papers and agreed to the deals, they said, "Who did we beat?" And we said, "Well, you didn't beat anybody. You were the only ones. You were the last man standing." And they said, "Well, that's cool. We like the company, and we think we're getting a fair value." So they were really good about it. Then you probably, once these folks enter into the process, you're going to sit with them and have management meetings, do the presentations, answer their questions, and at the same time probably have access to a virtual data room available to them so that they can start looking at some of the company's history and learning what they can about the company. I think an important element of the M&A process is to try to manage the clock. By that I mean, there's always, in the M&A process, there's a beginning and an end, and you want to make sure that they start out in the early phases. You want to try to get them up to speed, get them to learn as much about the company as they can. You of course want to try to preserve the most highly valuable items about your company, the most top secret information, to the end of the process, so that you don't dilute the value of the company by just giving that to everyone, but that they kind of have to earn their way to learn the top secret information just in time to submit their final bid. So that's what I mean by kind of managing the clock, is that we have to dance the dance. We want it to end with several people very interested in the company and willing to submit a very high offer at the very end of the process. So after you do your management presentations and give them access to the data room, you have final offers due. So the bankers typically have a date certain on which the offers are due, and those are sometimes believed by the buyers to be the final offers, but often we view them as just the beginning of the process. So we hope to walk them up from those proposals to yet higher and higher numbers. And during that process, you enter these periods of exclusive negotiation, and really that's the signal to the other buyers that the company is in serious negotiations to be sold. And so I've often thought, if I were on the buy side and the bankers go silent, in other words, they cannot no longer communicate with me or answer questions, this means that another buyer is now in a period of exclusive negotiation, and the deal is at very high risk that I'm going to lose the deal. So there was one particular weekend in a transaction where I expected to see an unsolicited offer come flying in over the transom from one of the buyers who was not in the exclusive negotiation, but it never happened. So they just weren't attuned to the signals that occur during this dance. So anyway, you get through this period of exclusive negotiation, you probably strike your final deal, and the next big step is for the press release to happen. And often those happen on Mondays, and then you typically hold meetings with employees, and it's often there to have the buyer there to help decompress the situation, explain why they were interested in the company, why they think it's a good acquisition, what their intention is going forward with the company. It helps decompress the employees that are going to go through, a significant change here. And I think for the most part, those have been handled well in the transactions I've been through. And then you're kind of in this period where you've announced, but you haven't quite closed, so a bunch of things happen in the background. You have to get through these regulatory clearances. with the Hart-Scott-Rodino, or maybe European agencies, or even the states have something to say about approving these transactions. So you're working in the background to get through these regulatory hurdles. You're doing this 280G math, which is a internal revenue code that has to do with golden parachutes, and so if there's severance payments involved, you want to make sure you understand the implications of 280G. There's often a consultant in the law firms that can do the math for you. You just, as the CFO, you want to provide them the information they need and make sure you're on top of what they're telling you. And then the fun part for you as a CFO is to either plan your own exit or negotiate your new job. So that's always fun. My own personal business model obviously has been to exit on the day of merger, and I've typically gotten a severance arrangement. If I haven't had a severance arrangement in place prior to the transaction, you have the opportunity to negotiate it while you're in the merger, the acquisition negotiations. So let's move on for a minute to data room consideration. So this is several of the things, if you haven't put up a data room before, there's a few things you can be thinking about here. Interestingly, when I first started down this road over the last 12 years, our data rooms were physical data rooms. So in both Penoderm and Collagen, we would actually build a physical data room, typically in a conference room at a law firm, and each of the buyers would be allowed to come in and spend some time in that data room. So you would block out time for each buyer to go in, and they would make lists of things they were interested in having copies of, and then your job was to review these lists and decide whether you wanted to provide copies of the information or not. So I would say the opportunity, the whole virtualization of this has really allowed us to move through this process much more expeditiously. In my Silicon Genetics transaction, I built data rooms myself on CD-ROMs and actually brought a series of laptops to a law firm's conference room and laid them all out and made sure that at the end of each day I collected the CD-ROMs and took them home with me. So that was the early stages of electronic data room, where there really wasn't a product on the market available to do this kind of thing. I built my own. And then over the last couple of years, we've seen the emergence of providers of virtual data rooms such as Pandesa that do this for a living and have put a lot of thought and energy into engineering a system to help you do this in a very efficient way. So the first topic you run into is, should we make this searchable or not? And where I come out on this is I prefer not to make it text searchable, just because I want to empower the buyer to learn the information. I just don't want them to have them too empowered to where they can get to the key issues immediately. I like to, since we are dancing a dance, I like to have like a warm-up phase and actually see them do some effort, which is to read the information from scratch and make their list of questions. Some of you may differ with me on that. I just think as the seller, we get to choose, we get to kind of control the process. We also get to choose what technology we're going to put up, and we get to make the decisions about who gets to see what and when. So that this is one area where I like to just use my own judgment. You'll also have to consider whether you want to have group or individual access and to which documents. I tend to think of it as exerting control at the document level. In other words, do I want this document to be downloadable by the buyers? Do I want it to be printable, or do I want them to only have access to be able to read it while they're live in the data room? And we can talk about that. It kind of leads into my next bullet here, which is kind of how to peel this onion. So as I think about the M&A process, it's kind of like peeling an onion, and you want to start with the outer laying being all the publicly available information and the things that if they could hustle or attend trade shows or see poster presentations at conferences, they would have learned about your company. So all of that is immediately available to everybody. And that's kind of the outside layer of this onion. Then we move to kind of private stuff, which is things that normally you wouldn't talk to the outside about. Maybe it's details about your balance sheet. It's being able to look at your account reconciliations, understand where your investment portfolio is located. Perhaps see some of the inner workings of the company, your distribution, your list of distributors, things that would be maybe possible for them to learn, but quite difficult. And so that's kind of this next layer of the onion. And then the middle of the onion is this top secret stuff. So it's the stuff that if everyone knew, it could virtually do some damage to your company. So you really need to think about what that might be. And a good example would be the IP area, so your patent portfolio. When you look at your patent portfolio, you have patents that are published, so they're publicly available. Those are things you should make immediately available. Then you have stuff that's submerged, so it means it's kind of in process. It's been filed, but it hasn't yet been published, so it's not available to the public. But it does give indications about where your technology is headed. And then the third element of IP might be the laboratory notebooks and future product designs, design iterations, improvements to your technology, things that if a competitor knew, they would know kind of where your company's headed and might be able to kind of cut you off at the pass or cobble together a quick product entry to compete against you. So again, you want them to be able to peel this onion back, but you always want to get the top secret stuff kind of at the end of the process. So it's your job as the CFO to kind of, as you're building the data room, to categorize this stuff and make sure that the top secret stuff is either available at the end of the process or it's read-only access, so that they can't print it and distribute it elsewhere, or certainly not download it and take it away with them. So I think it's important that you know every page, and I don't literally mean you know every piece of content, but that I think as you review everything that goes into the data room, you're the one making the decision about what level of access people should have to it. I think this indexing the data room is helpful when it comes to answering questions. So you'll find you get the same question over and over from multiple buyers, and it's helpful to just reference them to the appropriate documents in the data room. So that's just pretty efficient. Make sure you redact from, if you throw a payroll register up, you at least redact all the employee addresses and their social security numbers, of course. We talked about download versus print. And interestingly, the investment bankers, will say to you, give them everything, basically. Give them access to everything. And I think already I've discussed enough that you get a sense that you really don't want to make everything available. And I think it's important to recognize that we're the custodian of value in this transaction. So it's our job to make sure that we secure the highest purchase price for our investors, but that we also preserve the value for the acquirer of the company. And I've heard of other companies where they have just kind of had teams come in and put literally everything in the data room and make all of it available. And I do think that when competitors get that information, the ultimate acquirer is going to face immediate competition in the marketplace. So it is our job to make sure that the buyer who's paying an awful lot of money to acquire your company, that they come out the other side with substantial value, and that you've done what you could do to protect the value. And many times they don't understand that. So I think this gives you a little bit of cover when they're asking you, why can't I see that right now? You say to them, I actually hope you win this transaction, and what I'm trying to do here is preserve the ultimate value that you will realize when you acquire the company. So flipping on to the next slide. Another thing as part of the data room is that you can write a quick memo to cover many of the basics. So again, as you look down your due diligence checklist, there are several questions that are simple to answer, where I think just basically answering all those questions in a CFO memo and throwing it in the data room basically allows people to kind of check those boxes without having to see more documents. And then, for anything you have a lot of, whether it's consultants or distribution agreements, having a summary spreadsheet at the heading of that section of the data room. You may decide to put up every distributor contract into the data room. We did at St. Francis, and there, of course, the big issue is, if we want to terminate these distributors, how much do we have to pay? Do any of them have tail obligations and what have you? So we put up both a summary of who the distributors were, what territories they covered, and then we did have every distribution deal in the data room. So it's just helpful to give them a roadmap and allow them to decide how deep they wanted to go in their own diligence. And then finally, I also try to put in negative stuff. So, and you know, hopefully this is negative stuff that isn't open-ended. The open-ended negative stuff is harder for you to deal with, but you will often have to manage through. But I'm talking about things like maybe you've had some prior employee lawsuit against the company that was settled out and picked up by your insurance. Or, you know, if you're a life science company, you've had the FDA come in and issue a bunch of 483 observations about your manufacturing facility. That's all generally negative, but of course we work through those things, and it's important for the buyer to understand kind of the historical aspects of what the company's been through and how these difficult issues have been resolved. Moving along, we already kind of talked about some of this. You know, in terms of the Q&A, sometimes you can just quickly reference a document in the data room that handles the question. Some of the new, more modern virtual data rooms have secure Q&A. So there's an opportunity to do some online Q&A where they ask you a question and you respond, and then you can decide whether to make that question response kind of available to everyone else in the process, since that same question may recur several times. And I do think we're trying to keep a level playing field among the buyers. We want everyone to have the same knowledge of the company. So I do think it's important that if you miss something in the data room and you respond to a question, it's important to make sure that all the buyers receive that same information. And occasionally you'll find you've missed something. You can quickly, you know, supplement the data room and make everyone aware of it. And then another aspect of kind of the modern virtual data room that's fun and interesting is they allow you to observe who's looking at what in the data room from the buy side. So it not only allows all the buyers to be doing their diligence work at the same time, which is much more convenient than the old way where we had to take them one at a time through the information. It also allows you to kind of see who on their team is looking in what areas, and this is helpful in terms of you know, when you meet with them face to face, understanding who's kind of done what level of work in each area, so that it gives you a sense of their interest level, and also helps you kind of anticipate the issues they might raise when you get together face to face. And I also think time in the data room equates to interest level in the transaction. So you'll see that the buyers that are doing the most work, in my mind, they're earning their way to be able to see more, to eventually get to see the top secret stuff, and as well as you know, they're convincing you that their intentions are serious. They're not just there on a you know, on a competitive intelligence mission. They're actually there with a serious intention of making an offer for the company. So I had a few miscellaneous points here to talk about on negotiations, and that is a little bit about this notion of preemption. So oftentimes a company will come to you when you're outside of a process and say, we'd like to buy your company and we're willing to offer X. And you know, so you and your boss are tasked with deciding whether that offer is significant enough to take to the board as serious interest, or whether there's a sufficient premium there to justify entering into an exclusive negotiation with that potential buyer. So that's great when they happen. Unfortunately, you know, most of my transactions have been kind of more auction-oriented. So, you know, at any point in an auction process, someone may try to preempt the process by offering a large number and trying to get you to enter into an exclusive negotiation with them. And so that's something to be aware of. And yet, if the offer isn't high enough, you want to basically tell them, look, that's insufficient to enter into an exclusive negotiation. So now you're back in the general process with the rest of the buyers. Most of these deals have some sort of escrow that I think as CFO you got to worry about a little bit. And here I think your number one defense is the disclosure in the virtual data room. The more things you can disclose, that after the transaction, if there's any surprise, you can have an argument that it shouldn't hit the escrow because it was adequately disclosed at the time they made their offer. So, you know, virtually every transaction has a pool of money that's set aside, that's a chip back from the sale price of the company for issues that arise. And your job is just to try to manage that as best you can. And some of those will be complete surprises to you, but sometimes they can be anticipated and managed a little bit. Yeah, if you didn't have a severance agreement, you plan to leave, this is the time to kind of negotiate your exit. Despite the argument from the buyer that, hey, you're going to make a lot of money in this deal from your equity, it's also common to insist on a severance. Your job is going to go away. You have a nice annuity stream from your employer, and they're planning to take that away from you, and I believe you should be compensated for that. So don't be shy about, if you don't have a severance agreement, asking for it at the time you're negotiating the sale. And I have a thing here, the best deal point I ever made, and this is a fun story. But at St. Francis, we did a step transaction, so with an earnout. So our deal was $525 million in cash up front, and we were going to pay them 2 times whatever the sales were in a year over the subsequent year. And very cleverly, when we were negotiating this, we thought, well, what if the buyer sells their business to a third party? Well, then we said, well, as we thought about it, we said, they should be quite happy if they're selling their business at a nice step up. They should be quite happy to pay us our full earnout without actually having us demonstrate that the product could sell. So in this case, we had this 2x provision on U.S. sales, but 8 months after we sold our business to Kaifon, they decided to sell themselves to Medtronic, and lo and behold, the full amount of the earnout was due and payable without respect to our product sales. So we were quite enthusiastic about it, and interestingly, they had forgotten about this provision, so they were a little surprised when they announced their sale to Medtronic that they got a little email from us saying, hey, by the way, our $200 million is due. And there was some back and forth about it, but ultimately they agreed to pay it, and so we captured the full $725 million. So it's good to think broadly as you're in these negotiations. Think broadly about what could happen to the acquirer, and plan accordingly. In St. Francis, we talked a lot about certainty of value versus certainty of closure, and this is really where you're kind of evaluating the offers. So let's say I have an offer at $685 million. But it's got to go through a bunch of regulatory hurdles, particularly in Europe. Maybe just the nature of the business is that because of the combination, there could be more regulatory snags in approving it. So now you got a situation where you have different levels of value with different probabilities of closure, and so you have to sort this out and help your board sort it out. So it's just something you should think about as you're moving through the process, how to. And in the case of St. Francis, ultimately, we wanted, the answer is you want more cash and you want less contingencies on receiving the cash. And with respect to an earnout, it's kind of an interesting question because, if you say you don't want an earnout, does that signal that you don't believe your product is a valuable product and can sell? So it puts you in this conundrum where we decided to say, we're completely comfortable with an earnout because we believe in the product and we believe in your ability to sell the product. So, you send the right message to the buyer. But I do think it does depend on the size of the acquirer and how much attention they will put on your product as to whether you accept that type of arrangement. In the case of Kaifon, they were essentially betting their business on St. Francis. So we were going to represent about 1/3 of their company post-deal. And so we knew they couldn't hide in terms of disclosing the revenues of the X-Stop. They really did have to drive it. So that's how we got comfortable. But if I were selling to Medtronic, for example, how do you get comfortable that they're going to do a good job of selling your product so that you can earn the earnout? Then you get into all these discussions about, well, who's going to control the sales post-transaction, and are people going to be in place to make sure it happens or not? So there's a lot of business considerations to think about as you decide whether to do an earnout or not. And another element of St. Francis I thought was educational is we carve out a little bit of a fund from the proceeds to deal with post-deal fighting. So in this situation, you know, the scenario might be we have an earnout, they're not willing to pay it, or they're not, we don't feel they're paying us our fair amount on the earnout. We wanted to have a small fund to where our shareholder representative could you know, hire some lawyers and go after them. So, you know, if we distributed all the proceeds back to everybody, then we all would have to kind of like pitch in some money to fight with them, and that's unlikely to happen. So I think it makes sense that when you got a large amount of money coming across like this, to set up a little side fund to carve out, put it with one of your shareholders who will become your post-deal shareholder representative, and that person can decide whether the buyer is fulfilling their obligations under the transaction and deciding whether or not to fight with them. So I do think that's a pretty smart thing to do. And finally, and I'll wrap up here and we can get to some questions. You know, you'll have some conditions to close. These are things that they discover in diligence where they want you to, you know, kind of clarify the situation or clean it up before the transaction closes. And so these might be open disputes. You know, in the case of St. Francis, we had some patents that the founders had written and had always intended to assign to the company, yet the T's never got crossed, and so we had to run around and get some patents assigned to the company. You know, in another case, I had a sexual harassment lawsuit against the company that we ended up having to settle because the buyer just felt with their deep pockets that they would get taken for a lot more money than if our little company settled it out. So you know, I got to call a person up and say, today's your lucky day. We're going to make you a nice offer here to mop this up. So there'll be a few things like that. Another example was at SiliconGenix, we offered too much free life insurance for the employees, and one of their technical people caught it that you're only allowed to offer $50,000 a year of life insurance as a non-compensated benefit, and so it presented this interesting problem of how do we go back and amend everybody's compensation for the prior few years. And it turns out you can go direct to the IRS and kind of do a mea culpa and settle for a lump sum. So we were able to quickly run that process and get this thing resolved so that our deal could close. So those are a couple of examples of these conditions to close. And then finally, I'll make a little commercial here for Pandesa and the ShareVault. I'm a business advisor to Pandesa. I've been working with the company for 3 years. I have seen most of the available virtual data rooms that are available. I think the ShareVault application is as slick and as nice and as easy to use as any of them. And I offer, for those of you in the life science industry, you know, the question you probably run into, and one of the first questions you would ask any VDR provider is, can you give me examples of transactions that you've supported? And here's a couple of large ones in life sciences. The Adiza Biomedical Cytec transaction, which went down for $356 million, was done on the Pandesa ShareVault, as was last year's Viziogen sale to Abbott for $400 million last September. So there's a couple of large transactions where, you know, lots of money was at stake, and people were very serious about which technology platform they chose. And you know, not only should we be thinking about data rooms for M&A transactions, but there are many possible purposes to have a data room available to you, and that could be if you're a biotech and you're interested in doing a lot of alliance and partnering type transactions, or if you're you know, a private company doing a series of financings over the next few years, where you're going to be subject to due diligence every, you know, 12 to 18 months. You might just want to basically put up a permanent data room, and Pandesa would certainly be happy to talk to you about some type of a rental model, which would have a very low cost associated with it, where you could have your data room up on a monthly basis. So with that, those are my prepared comments. I hope you guys got something out of it today, and I'd like to open up for Q&A.
Muted. Unmuted.
Okay, we have a question I'm going to read. The question is, how do you decide when to enter into exclusive negotiations? What duration have you found is typical?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you have to be comfortable you're kind of at the end of the process and that the value has been maximized, and really that's a a joint conclusion by your board and you and your boss and the bankers as well should have some input there, and typically those periods of exclusive negotiation are quite short. They're like 7 days, maybe even shorter than that, to basically see if you can bang out, the final terms to allow, to be done with the process and to actually have a deal that you're ready to announce. So, you want those to be pretty short, because basically you're in the final short strokes of a transaction happening.
Okay, we have another question is, what are success fees for DI banks these days, and how they differ between boutique and the larger bulge banks?
Yeah, well, this is a good question, and I think it depends a little bit on the size of your company, because a smaller transaction value, $20 million company is not going to throw as big a fee as a couple $100 million transaction. So, and this area, and things do change over time, but generally through my 4 transactions, I think, as a rule of thumb, 1% of the deal value is typical. I would say in a small transaction like Silicon Genetics, it's probably much higher than 1%. It could be as high as maybe even 5 to 10%, because you need to have adequate incentive to get this talent to come in and help you find a transaction and get it done. So I think 1% is a good rule of thumb if you're up in the couple $100 million value range. And again, I would encourage you to do a tiered fee structure to make sure that the bankers are adding as much value as possible to finding the highest value possible for the company.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Another question we have is, if the virtual data room tracks user access during the due diligence, are there any legal or privacy issues? That is, if users are not informed in advance that access will be tracked, is there a potential issue?
That's a great question, and I honestly don't know the answer. You might want to bounce this off a lawyer, but I think when they log into a data room, I know that they typically have to accept a disclaimer of some kind, but I don't think that this is unknown to the buyers these days. I think they know that they're coming onto your field. They're coming onto a system that the seller has control over, and I would think they fully expect that anything they do in that system is going to be available for the seller to view.
Thank you. Another question: do you expect the new healthcare bill will have an impact on M&A transactions?
Wow, that's a big and expansive question. Yeah, boy, that's almost too big for me to comment on. Really, I don't have an opinion on that, to be honest.
Another question is, and you mentioned this, but is the full text, search, document search, really useful in accelerating the due diligence process? Have you found that to be true?
So, yeah, so I haven't actually had full text available in any of my transactions, but so it's a little bit of a conceptual question, but I do think it's kind of nice for the buyer side to be able to type a few keywords in and flush out every single document among 14,000 pages that refers to that term. So they might type in the word accrued liability, for example, and pop out every reference in the database related to accrued liabilities. Whether or not they could use it successfully to flush out the main issues, I don't know. If it did, if it allowed for a more constructive Q&A and getting to a faster understanding on any of the risk areas. It probably would accelerate it. But I think, and ultimately you've got to get through that with everybody, so you're going to get to those issues eventually. The question in my mind is, does it accelerate it? Is accelerating it a benefit to the seller or the buyer? So that's kind of where I'm still thinking about that.
And then another question is, what are typical earnout structures? You referenced one that was based purely on revenue, but what other types of structures have you seen?
So yeah, of my 4 deals, only one had an earnout, and it never really was earned out. So I'm not that great here, although I've seen several life science transactions, and in some of them, they've been so onerous that the selling side management team has had to commit to employment relationships with the acquirer for a protracted period of time in order to achieve the earnout milestone. So, for example, I think in this recent eValve transaction, Farrell and Powell has said she's going to stay with the project until it gets approved by the FDA. So she's agreed to go across to the acquirer and actually monitor the project from her prior company until it receives FDA approval. So that's an example of one that was milestone based, perhaps, but so they can all be a little different in terms of what the milestones are, and I think the ones that are sales dependent are particularly difficult, because if you integrate the sales forces, then the selling company loses a little bit of control over how much emphasis is put on that product, and it may receive a lot less emphasis by the acquiring company, and therefore put the earnout in jeopardy. So I do think you need to be smart about thinking about the scenarios and how it might play out and who's going to actually control things post-deal.
Okay, well, thank you, Mike. This has been very valuable, and I hope all of you have learned something from this, our first of our series. And with that, I think we're going to close off for today, and we look forward to seeing you on one of our next Life Science webinar series. Thank you.